the last 2 weeks, and it's maddening. I'm Christine Wevik, or you can just call me Chris. I'm the author of 4 books. My most recent, as you know, is Someone Knows. It's a book about South Dakota's cold cases, and then actually it's about 52 of the more than 150 cases that I found of unsolved deaths, disputed deaths, or missing persons just since 1969. I didn't go back any further than that because the whole point of the book was to bring awareness to these cases and get people talking and hopefully bring in leads. And I figured with cases that occurred before 1969, it's unlikely that we'll ever see closure for those cases because perpetrators probably dead or beyond the reach of prosecution, in my opinion. Not that I wouldn't in a future book put other cold cases in there that are kind of interesting. As I mentioned, I'm the author of other books. My first book is called It's Only Hair. It's a humorous self-help book about living with baldness. I have alopecia, so I don't have any hair other than what I buy. And it's a book about just a lot of stories about things that I've experienced as a wig wearer. And the book talks more about attitude and coping than it does about hair loss. And it covers all types of hair loss like chemo and chemo-related hair loss and male and female pattern baldness and alopecia, which is what I have, all types of hair loss, but most of it is about maintaining a healthy attitude about it. I would say this is the book I had to write, mostly because my therapist said so. But this is the book I always wanted to write. Once I got this book written and got it published, then I said, okay, now I'm moving into writing because that was always my life dream. So I decided to write the book that I always wanted to write, which is Vacant Eyes. It's a mystery with a little bit of a paranormal twist. It's about a woman who is brutally attacked, and from that, she acquires the ability to see memories in old abandoned houses. So if you've ever wondered what kind of stories old houses could tell, my main character can see things and hear things that happened in these old houses. So once she discovers this ability, she decides to use it to find her friend who went missing 16 years earlier. And in the midst of that investigation, she finds out that her own unsolved abduction and attack might be related to her friend's disappearance. So she has to investigate her own attack, which is harrowing in itself. That was the first book in the series. The second book in the series is called Borrowed Memories. These are both standalone, but they have the same main character. And in this book, Bryn, now that the local sheriff discovers she has this ability, he wants her to work with him on local cold cases. And so that gets her into a little bit of trouble too. These books, I mean, for a first novel and the second novel, I was really quite amazed that they have done pretty well. This one, Vacant Eyes, won the Bronze Zippy Award and was a finalist in 4 competitions. Borrowed Memories was a finalist in 1 competition, and last year won the Silver Falchion Best Supernatural and Best Book of the Year at Killer National Conference down in Nashville, Tennessee. So that was really exciting. I kind of felt like I was at the height of I just reached the top and I don't have to do anything else until I wrote this book. And I will say that this is what I had to do. This is what I wanted to do. This is my passion. And I would say this has become more of a mission. I started out researching this book 4 years ago because of the 2 Vermilion girls, the girls in our area who had gone missing, Cheryl Miller and Pamela Jackson. I'm sure you've heard about them. And they were found over 40 years later in their car. That was 3 miles from our house. And I was obsessed with that case when I first married my husband because I heard about it all the time. And it was kind of local lore. And I was obsessed with the case. I wanted to find these 2 girls and I wanted to write about them. And also, I know of 3 of these cases personally, actually 4. One of them is a classmate, John Rice, who was murdered in Jackson Hole, and that murder was never solved. A family friend of ours, her daughter was murdered in Centerville, and that was never solved. And then a friend in town, her sister was murdered. She was living in Sioux Falls, but she was found dead in Laverne, Minnesota, and that was never solved. And then while I'm working on the book, a friend of mine's son went missing, and I thought, Gene will be found. He'll be found. He won't be one of these cold cases that I'm writing about. And lo and behold, 3 years later, he's still not been found. So I decided to add him to the book. And incidentally, 2 or 3 weeks ago, near the area where he went missing, they found bone fragments and a piece of fabric and his cell phone. And they, of course, sent in the bone fragments for DNA testing to find out, make sure that was actually him. But when I was talking with Pat, his mom, she said, it doesn't make sense that that bone fragments would be found there. First of all, it was a slough that was waist deep water back when he went missing. And this was in March. It would have been incredibly cold water. He would not have wandered into that ditch and just died there. She said that slough, they searched everywhere, all the sloughs, every wooded area, every creek, every river, every field they could find with search crews and cadaver dogs and sniffer dogs, and they found no trace of him. They searched that area 4 times and he was not there. And now they find just little bone fragments and a piece of fabric and his phone. And I am generally a suspicious person. I tend to think, and maybe it's because of the book, but I tend to think that somebody got nervous about the extra attention, more people talking about this case, and that whoever is responsible for his disappearance maybe dug up just a little bit of him and threw it in that dried up slough. Now it's dried up, and the hunters apparently found this phone and the bone fragments, and afterward they cut and baled it. So now she said, how do we even know if he's there? Why would they? And cadaver dogs didn't pick up anything more than these little fragments. They can pick up a scent from years ago, and they did not find any more of his body. And in a slough, I think it would be incredibly difficult for an animal to drag off a part of his body, especially a big guy like Gene. And there was nothing more found of him. So anyway, that's another case that's kind of personal to me, and I'm really hoping that they find out some answers. And the sad thing about that is it would answer only one question, that he's dead, but it actually creates more questions, you know. And
did the DNA results come back on that?
They haven't had DNA results come back.
Okay.
And it's sad because they say, oh, it could take 6 to 9 months. And I'm like, wow, that's astounding, because I mean, when you're working on a high profile case, they have results like within days. So I can't imagine a worse pain for a parent to have to endure. And she said, it won't matter. We're going to keep looking for you, for the rest of you, to bring you home, and we're going to find out who's responsible, where you were, and what happened that night. So as I said, I started working on this book 4 years ago. And when I started researching it, I saw an article on KELO that mentioned Marty Jackley, who was Attorney General then, and he said that there were 30 unsolved cases in South Dakota. And I thought, 30? Okay, I know of a handful of those. So, I mean, 30 cases, that would be kind of an interesting book, especially since the girls hadn't been found yet. So I knew of a few of them myself, and I thought, okay, that would be kind of an interesting book to write. But then I contacted them and said, I told them what I was doing. I was working on this book just to highlight the cases and try and get attention to them and send people to the proper authorities to turn in tips. And they said, we have no reservations with what you're doing. Good for you. I asked them for a list of names. I just wanted a list of names and maybe counties or dates that they went missing or were murdered. And they wrote back and said, good luck. You have our blessing, but we don't have a list. And I'm like, okay, so I just started researching, and then I thought, oh, wait a minute, if they don't have a list, how do they know there are 30 cases?
Exactly.
I think I just got lied to. I'm a little slow on the uptake there. So I just started, she said, you'll have to contact each county sheriff yourself. So I spent the next few days or weeks finding every sheriff's email address. I emailed every sheriff in South Dakota, and I heard back from maybe 5. And those 5 were supportive, but they didn't have any cold cases. Then I sent out physical letters, and I got response back from maybe another 4 more. And they said, sorry, we forgot to write to you before. Good luck with your project, and we hope it helps, but we don't have any cases in our county. So 9 out of 66 is all I heard back from. And really, that should have been my tip off as to how much help I was going to get. Now, I'm not gonna bash anybody, because I know law enforcement agencies are overworked and understaffed. And a lot of times when an agency decides to look into cold cases, it's a detective on his own time that pulls those boxes out and looks at them and looks through the suspect list, or looks through the witness list, or the tips, or the photos, or whatever, or takes the time to send in the DNA to get a hit. So I'm not here to bash law enforcement, but I will say I was not prepared for how difficult it would be to research for these cases, especially since I found more than 150 cases. And of those 155 plus, the 52 that are in this book are the ones that I found the most information on. Sometimes, especially with Native Americans, you can't find anything more than a name and maybe a date, because the crimes that are committed on the reservations, they don't have like a big newspaper on the reservations. Sometimes you'll find something in the Lakota Times talking about the crime of a missing person, or a hit and run, or a suspicious death. But it's hard to find information about Native Americans. 74% of the cases that I found are Native American. Shortly before this book went to publication, I found through Angela Kennecke at KDLO, who incidentally wrote the foreword for my book, she sent me a link to another Native American site that listed more names, more suspicious deaths or missing persons. And I briefly looked into those names and found another 38 that could be added to this. And that would bring the total to 193 cases, 77% Native American, which is heartbreaking. And in the case of Native Americans, especially on the reservations, a lot of times once something is deemed a federal crime, such as kidnapping or murder, it's handed off to the FBI. And the FBI will take the evidence, they'll take all the notes, they'll take everything related to that investigation, and they own it. And they will sometimes share with the BIA, but local law enforcement kind of left out of the loop. And the FBI can opt to decline a case and not tell local law enforcement that they're declining it for whatever reason, declining to look into it. So once that happens, local law enforcement, they don't have the evidence back. They don't have the case files. They can't look into it even if they want to. And so there's a lot of jurisdictional issues with suspicious deaths and missing persons on reservations. So I can see why a lot of those don't get solved. Not only are there disproportionate number of cases involving Native Americans, there is a very highly disproportionate number of cases that are solved for Native Americans, which I can understand why they're so upset, why they're so frustrated and bitter. And when I was working on this book, it took a lot of patience and just listening, trying to understand what they're going through. And they are very distrustful of anyone wanting to be involved with their cases, and I completely understand it. They've been let down a lot. And so I was honored that they trusted me with the cases that are included in this book. And most of them included a tribute with their loved one's story. And while I was working on this book, I also was approached by quite a few people who said, have you heard of my mom's case? Can you please put her case in your book? My brother is missing. Can you please put his story in your book? So there are a lot of cases that I added because people reached out to me. Angela Kaneki, as mentioned before, came to my house last summer and interviewed me about this book. And at the time I had 83 cases, and I found even more since then. She wrote the foreword, and she endorsed the book on the back. And so I feel it's a very important book because like I said, I started out thinking 30 cases would be an interesting book. But when I got to 150, I thought, no, it's not just interesting, it's important. These are people's lives that are in this story, in this book. When, I mentioned my friend in town whose sister's body was found in Laverne, Minnesota. I spoke with him. I didn't speak with him. I emailed him. He contacted me and said he'd read Borrowed Memories, and his wife had bought it. She worked as a nurse with my brother, and she really liked the book, so he read it. And he wrote to me and said, I really liked your book. It was very entertaining. I was a little sad that law enforcement was put in a bad light, but I understand. And so I wrote back and said, they're in every walk of life, doctors, lawyers, everyone. There's bad people everywhere, not just law enforcement. So it was nothing personal. And he said, no, I understand that. And he said, I'm a retired sheriff here in Laverne. And I went, oh, okay. So do you know about Kelly Robinson's story? And he said, oh yeah, I do. I was a sheriff when she was found. I said, well, can you tell me about that? Because her story is in my upcoming book. And he said, well, I can't really tell you a lot, just what was in the papers. That's all we know. And I said, do you plan on opening it up? Have you gotten any leads? Can you send anything in for DNA? And he said, no, she was found in the water. There's no DNA. There was only a pair of pants and a jacket. And I don't even know if we have it anymore. And I said, well, okay, maybe you can answer this. Can you explain why when I contact sheriff's offices about getting information, I kind of get pushed off? He's in a meeting, he'll call you back, or he's not here, or whatever. And he said, oh, it's nothing personal, he said, but we just don't have time to look into cold cases. And he said, it sounds a little crass to say, but out of sight, out of mind. And I thought, that works at my house, but these are people's lives. Mm-hmm. And these families, it is never out of sight, out of mind. It is on their mind all the time. And so I always felt it was important to bring that up so that when you're reading these stories, keep in mind that these family members see this book as hope. They see it as getting the word out there, getting people talking, and that was the whole goal in writing this book. I will tell you that there are some cases in this book that are considered closed because whoever, law enforcement or FBI or whoever, has deemed it as such. They have just closed the book on that case, and it will probably not get reopened unless new evidence comes forward. And the three that are considered actually closed in this book are the three most bizarre cases in the book. And it seems strange that you would think that if they're going to put the word closed on it, that it would look at least open and shut. But the three cases that are closed are not open and shut. There are a lot of questions that go with them. I'll tell you about a couple of them. One of them is Cody Rodriguez, a young Native American man who moved from Porcupine to Salt Lake City. And he was staying with a friend there. The friend said that he was just stepping out of his apartment where Cody was staying with him. He was just stepping out onto the balcony area of their apartment to have a cigarette. And Cody had just stepped inside the door. He had just come home and stepped inside the door, and he shot himself in the back of the head. And his friend was telling law enforcement, yeah, he just stepped inside the door and shot himself, and I heard it, and I came in, I went and got a towel and put it underneath his head, and I called you. So law enforcement gets there, and the friend is, you can see in private investigators, the police photos that the private investigator had acquired, that the young man is standing out in the hallway being questioned by police, and you can see a blood trail from this apartment 4 doors down to a different apartment. And the police never questioned anyone in that other apartment. They never went and took photos. They never questioned any of the occupants in that apartment. But just took the kid's word for it that he came home, stepped inside the door and shot himself in the back of the head. If you're going to shoot yourself, why go to all that trouble? You're going to want to make sure you get it done right. You're going to do it in the side of the head more than likely or under your chin. So the police apparently were questioning this kid. They picked up Cody, took him to the hospital. He's still alive miraculously, but he died at the hospital 20 minutes later. And he was immediately sent to the coroner. The coroner removed, they had taken off his hat at the scene, but his clothes and his shoes were still on him. And they bagged all of those up and gave them to Ina May, his mother. And so she got the shoes and socks and the pants and the shirt and all of that. She got all of that back from the coroner. Months later, when law enforcement said that case is closed, they sent her all of the evidence. And in that bag of evidence from the apartment and from wherever was a pair of tennis shoes. And she said, these aren't Cody's shoes. And they said, oh yeah, they are. They're from the apartment. She said, he was wearing his shoes when he was sent to the coroner, to the hospital and then to the coroner. He was wearing the shoes and I have them. And they said, well, these were at the scene. They're probably a different pair of shoes of his. She said, no, these are the roommate's shoes. And there are blood droplets on top of the pair of shoes. And you can see in crime scene photos that they were across the room, but the roommate was not wearing them when he was questioned. And when they found the gun had been washed. You can see the blood on the gun was diluted, like the gun had been washed. And they found traces of blood throughout the apartment, including on a empty toilet paper roll in the drawer of a bathroom vanity, and in the kitchen and in the bathroom. And it just did not make sense. And they said, no, it was suicide because he had sent a text to his girlfriend a few weeks ago when they broke up that he just didn't want to live it anymore without her. But they never questioned the people down the hall. So I can see why Ina May is frustrated and she is mad and she will not stop talking. And I'm like, good for you. You keep shouting. That's just one of the bizarre cases. Another one is Morgan Lewis. I'm not sure if you remember this case, but it's a professor who was found shot dead on campus at Northern State University in Aberdeen. He was found on the sidewalk right outside his building. When he was found, he was shot behind the left ear. He's right-handed. He was in his t-shirt. His jacket, his book bag, his keys were found inside the building. He was on the sidewalk. A gun was found in a dumpster 50 feet away underneath the trash, and they called it suicide. There are conflicting reports about whether there was a blood trail going to the dumpster or from the dumpster, I should say. And actually that kind of helps me because the police reports will say there was definitely a blood trail. So he shot himself at the dumpster and walked over to the side. He threw the gun in there, walked over the sidewalk and died, wanted to make it look like murder. Well, how could you guarantee shooting yourself in the back of the head with your non-dominant hand that you are going to survive long enough to make it look like murder? I would assume that someone who wants to make it look like murder would maybe shoot themselves in the back or something where they can hold the blood in long enough to get to the sidewalk. Also, they say that, first of all, Morgan was an incredibly intelligent man. He spoke several different languages. He never stopped going to school. I mean, he was addicted to education. He was involved in a lot of different organizations and different groups there at the college, and he was embedded. He wanted to stay there. He was very involved, and it didn't make sense that he would commit suicide. So here's, and the people who were on campus that day, one of them is a very good friend of mine. She said there was no blood trail. James Buck, his partner, said there was no blood trail. Other employees that I spoke with said, no, there was no blood trail. So those conflicting reports actually kind of helped me, because then I can pose questions at the end of each chapter and say, which is it? You know, which, the blood trail, either way, doesn't seal the deal either way, in my opinion. But it does help you raise questions. And there was a lot of chaos surrounding this case and the police force at the time that this happened. Apparently, the chief of police either resigned or was asked to leave, and just a lot of shake-up at the police department. And it's speculated by people in Aberdeen, in that area, that perhaps they were pressured to put a label of suicide on this case so it wouldn't bring more bad press to the university. Because there was a death there not too long before, a young man had died, and some were saying it was an assault and some were saying it was an accident. And so they deemed that one an accident, so who really knows? But the whole point of it is, we need to keep talking, we need to keep, excuse me, bringing up, you know, logical theories. Maybe this crime will get solved if it is indeed a crime. And my theory on bringing these cases to light is that when people start talking, things happen. You know, I watch a lot of crime shows on TV. Do I have any ID fans here? I love it, and I love the shows that show you how the bad guy gets caught.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's just a slip of the tongue. It's somebody talking a little too loud in the bar, or pillow talk, you know, or someone who threatens a significant other and says, if you don't toe the line, what happened to her is going to happen to you, you know, that kind of thing. Or a cellmate who says, he confessed. Or someone who just can't live with their conscience anymore. Maybe they alibi the perpetrator and now they don't want to take that to the grave. But things happen when people talk. And I think about certain cases that get solved because of one little tiny slip up. Like this case always stands out in my mind. This case about this woman who was murdered in her bed, and her husband was out playing cards at the time with friends and at a bar. And so the friends say, no, he was here all night. They alibied him, all of them did. He was here all night. And one of them eventually said, oh wait, he stepped out for a few minutes to call his wife. He just stepped out to the lobby to use a payphone, that's back when there were payphones, and called his wife, and he came back in a few minutes, and we continued. It wasn't any big deal, but he wasn't gone that long. And so the case got shelved because they couldn't find any leads. So then the police started looking into it again, and I think it was months or years later, and found out that someone said, well, come to think of it, when I went out to use the restroom, I went through the lobby and he wasn't there, but he probably stepped out for a cigarette. Because when he came back, he didn't have his coat on. So he must have just left his coat in his car. And the police were like, so he didn't have his coat on when he came back from calling his wife and maybe stepping out for a cigarette. And she said, right. And they said, what kind of coat was it? And she said, well, it was like a letterman's jacket, you know, dark with white sleeves. And they said, that's interesting. About how long do you think he was away from the table? And she said, well, it was 20 minutes. And they're like, okay. So they're looking at crime scene photos. And they're looking at the time it takes to get from this bar to his house. And they found in the crime scene photos this coat hanging on the bedroom door in the room where she was shot with blood on it. He had gone home and murdered his wife and came back. And just that little tip from someone who knows something that just happened to say, oh, just to see, yeah, he wasn't in the lobby. He probably stepped out for a cigarette. She didn't even knew what she knew. But that's how cases get solved. So, so some of these are, I think, I'm hoping, possible of being solved. The third case I will tell you about is Arnold and Ruby. And I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with Arnold Archambault and Ruby Bruyere from Lake Andes, a young Native American couple who were out partying with her cousin. And it was early in the morning. They're still out driving around right outside Lake Andes. Somehow their car ends up upside down in the ditch. And Tracy, who's in the back seat, said that when she came to, apparently she was knocked out. Arnold was not in the car. Ruby was in the front and screaming, oh my God, kicking the door, kicking the dash, trying to get out. She got the door open and squeezed out, and the door went shut. And Tracy couldn't get out of the car. And so she had to wait to be rescued. She didn't understand why they left her. Eventually, she tells investigators they got in the car and left. But that wasn't until much later. But that night, they're thinking Arnold and Ruby have to be here somewhere. And it was bitter cold. It was in December of '92. And they searched that ditch, which was just across the berm from the lake. They searched that ditch. They searched the lake, which was frozen solid. They searched the woods nearby. They searched in town. This is just outside of Lake Andes, less than a mile. And they never found those kids. And Bill Youngstrom, who was deputy sheriff at the time, was obsessed with this case. He went looking for them himself. They had search parties. They had family members looking for these kids and never found them. 3 months later, someone passing by that site, 75 feet from where the accident had happened, he saw something like a body in the ditch and he stopped. And there's Ruby. And she's floating in the water in the ditch. And this is in March. And so the snow that had blown into the ditch had melted. So they thought, well, if Ruby's here, then maybe Arnold's here. So they pumped the ditch and then they found Arnold 15 feet away from her. Ruby was severely decomposed. Arnold looked like he died in his sleep the night before. He was in pristine condition. And he was underwater, and everyone's saying, well, it's because she was exposed to the elements and he was not. They were both found in the same body of water. Why was he not exposed? Why was he not floating? All the articles I found on them make a point of saying neither of them were frozen to the ground, which tells me that there's no reason why he wouldn't have been floating if he's decomposed as her. So there are little twists and turns in the story because there's a girl who claimed to have seen Arnold on New Year's Eve a couple weeks after he went missing. And he was in a car with a couple guys. She reported it to police and said, I saw Arnold. And they said, what was happening? Well, I saw him in a car with a couple guys. The guys, I asked them if they were coming into the party, and they said, no, we're not staying. And they drove away. And she took a lie detector and she passed. But when they questioned the two young men that was with Arnold, they did not pass. But there was no proof saying that he was in that car, that he was actually alive. So they couldn't really pursue anything in that situation. Also, in the ditch in which they were found, there was no water inlet, no water outlet. So it's not like a little river that flowed through there. It was a ditch where the only water that was standing was from snow that had blown in and melted. They never found Ruby's shoes or her glasses. They were never found. And the police eventually came up with the explanation that they died of exposure. They died the same day as the accident, that there was no foul play involved, but the bodies were not there because they had been searched. The bodies had been moved there, but there's no foul play. And like, who just moves bodies? I mean, I do, but that's just me. I mean, what kind of logic would anyone have to find a body and move it to that location? How do you explain the fact that these two kids were in completely different states of decomposition and then say that they died of exposure? And as Karen Archambault said, his aunt, if they weren't hurt, they wouldn't have died there. They were less than a mile from town. They could have walked to get help. There's no reason for them to have died in that ditch. And they weren't hurt. They couldn't find any reason why they were dead. But law enforcement said they both died the same day. Yes.
And also, Arnold was found basically at the bottom of the ditch after everything thawed. Well, if the lake right next to it is frozen solid, the ditch water would be too. How do you get down there?
The day.
I mean,
right.
that
Well,
can't
and they-
happen when it's frozen solid without, oh yeah, major clues to it happening.
Right. Well, there are pictures of law enforcement out on the lake looking for holes in the ice. From my understanding, there was no ice in the ditch when they were in the accident. And really, even if they had flipped their car into the ditch and there was ice there, wouldn't it be an assumption that they'd be under the ice? And if there was ice there, the car would have broken it. And if there was a hole in the ice, they would have investigated that immediately. So everyone says, law enforcement, Bill Youngstrom, the family, the community, everyone says they were not there. They admit that area had been searched many, many times and they were not there. So it doesn't make sense that their bodies would be found in this. And there was a clump of her hair found 30 feet down the road that they said could not have been there for 3 months. So it doesn't make sense. So they're thinking that maybe that clump of hair fell off when the bodies were being dumped. They were moved there, but there's no foul play. So that's weird. So I hope that if you read this book, whether you buy it or get it from the library, that you talk about it with your friends and neighbors. There are families whose loved ones' stories are in this book, and they want closure. They want answers. And some may never see justice. And I'm familiar with the case, one of the cases in here is A.J. Lefkins. He's a young man who went missing up by Sisseton, and he was involved in a bar fight. He had just gotten out of jail and did not want to scrabble with anyone, but he got ganged up on at this bar, and then he got taken outside and beaten to within an inch of his life. And they said, he's hurt really badly, we need to take him to the hospital. So it was an ex-girlfriend and one of her male friends said, we'll take him, put him in this pickup. He was never seen again. Those two kids, eventually, that pickup got sold or something, and they never found any evidence. He never showed up at a hospital. They still haven't found his body. And to this day, his family said, we don't even care if anyone's persecuted. They will pay in maybe another realm. But now we just want to bring AJ home. We just want to know where he's at. We just want to bring his body home. And I can't imagine a worse pain for a parent to never know what happened to their child, you know, to have to take that to their grave. I think about Pam Jackson and Cheryl Miller. The last surviving parent, Oscar Jackson, dies at the age of 102. And 5 days later, their bodies are found in the car. And I'm like, okay, that was maybe divine intervention, but maybe it's a family member who said, you know what, I'm going to look in the last place they were seen and just happened to see that car sticking up out of the water. It was a little serendipitous, of course, that we had had a flood 2 years before they were found, and it probably washed a lot of the silt off the car. And then it was a drought the year before, so the water level was really low in the creek. So, I mean, it's understandable why the car was found, but it never really says who found them. I don't know, I choose to think it's a family member, but in any case, I'm glad they were found, and at least the siblings and other family members can put some closure on that. I hate to use that word. Yeah, I think I just want you to keep that in mind when you're reading these stories. I will tell you that I'm going to open us up into questions, and I've been asked a lot of questions, and one of them is actually it was asked by him. Have you heard of any tips that have come in from your book? Has it elicited any new leads in any of these cases? And I told him at the time, it had only been out for a month and a half, and I said, I don't think I'm really very high on the list of people to call for law enforcement to call if a tip comes in. So I will probably only know if the case gets solved, and then eventually it comes out that there was just a lot of talk after the book came out. So I'm hoping that it leads to one or more of these cases being solved. Another question I got asked a lot was, are you fearful for your life? And I said, when I was telling Angela this, I said, I wasn't until y'all started asking me. Yeah, I put up cameras and I lock all my doors, so yeah. And the last question, this is my fun story and I own it now. I was being interviewed for this book by the local paper here. I'm not going to say the exact person who asked me this because he's probably embarrassed, but Nancy was there. And the man asking me the question said, so I was looking over the other books you published, and you had one about living with hair loss. What's that about? And why did you write a book like that? I said, well, because I'm bald. And he's like, really? That's a wig? I said, yeah. And he said, it's beautiful. And I said, thanks. It's from Australia. I always say that. And he said, oh, hair from down under. I said, And one of the funniest parts of that story is that he didn't understand.
Those are even more fun. Yeah.
I know. These are unstable for me, and everybody in the room, everyone's laughing except for him. And then after a second, he went, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. And he was partially bald on top. Even the top of his head was red. And I felt bad for a moment, but I own that joke now, so I'm glad he asked me. So it's not from down under. It's from up above, and I love it. So anyway, now I'm going to open this up to questions. If anybody has any questions, yes.
The first two books, do you have them on audio?
I actually have the first one recorded, but I haven't uploaded it yet. But I'm hoping to do that soon. Okay, I know a lot of people really like listening to book on audio. Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
You have a reference to a Mathis family case in the book?
Yes.
I
The
don't know anything
Mathis
about it.
murders.
I just saw it recently on a search. I don't know any details, but.
John Mathis, LaDonna Mathis and her two boys, Patrick and Brian. Are you talking about that one that happened in Mitchell?
Yes.
Yeah. And there's another author who wrote a book just about that book, just about that case. His name is Noel Hamill.
Was that a recent?
The 80s.
Oh, an 80s.
Yeah, I think it happened like in 84 or something. Did a lot of research on this book, and so some of the dates aren't exactly popping up in my head, but yeah, it was in the 80s. And that is one of the few cases in the book in which the suspect was tried and acquitted. But I included them because they're still unsolved. So John Mathis was tried and acquitted for the murder, and so it's still considered an open case. It's one of the most tragic, yes.
She was a banker where I used to work across the street from me, so she signed my paper every day. LD LaDonna Gerlach, she was.
Yes.
That
Yes.
was not too far from the lecture, That's where I used to live.
Her
I
sister.
didn't see him out, and afterwards, people just didn't trust well, then you probably know that, they didn't trust the things that were not covered in the investigation.
Oh, yeah, and there are a lot of,
Key to the car.
a lot of law enforcement who said, oh, yeah, there was a lot of things overlooked in that investigation that really might have led to his being acquitted. So that case, one of the more heartbreaking, I think, just because kids are involved. I do have a story of some children. One of them is baby Andrew in Sioux Falls. I'm sure you've heard about that one. I was living in Sioux Falls, not too far from where that baby was found at the time. And that one always haunted me. And the thing that always stuck out in my mind was how the person who found this little baby said that there were tears frozen to his face. And I'm like, oh my word, just ripped my heart out. And what I find kind of appalling is that they found the person the mother, and all of the old articles, the coroner said that baby was alive for 2 hours in the ditch, that their findings determined that baby was alive for about 2 hours in the ditch, that he basically bled out and died of exposure. But when she was tried, she was not found guilty of murder or abandoning this child in the ditch, because they said they can't prove the baby was alive when it was placed in the ditch. And I'm like, are you not going by past reports? Was he autopsied again? And in that case, how do you get the same finding that the original coroner found? That part I found frustrating, because it was like two different findings there. One said he was alive for 2 hours in the ditch, and the other one says we don't know for sure if he was alive when he was placed in the ditch. So anyway, I mean, she's
Would that still be
paying
abuse of
the
a
price.
corpse?
Pardon me?
Would it still be abuse of a corpse if it was?
Maybe.
Something.
Was
And
that the baby that still, did he have any of the birth stuff still with him, like the umbilical cord and all that?
yeah, I believe so.
Okay.
Yep.
So he was
Yeah, I think-
just born.
Just one.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, I think the placenta was still attached, and so he just bled out. Any other questions? Yes.
So in your opinion, like when it comes to like law enforcement, like when they don't like ask questions or whatnot, do you think that's just lack of experience or negligence?
I don't think, well, that depends. I really don't think it's probably lack of experience, because I think in some cases, especially the Mathis, where they were not prepared for a case like that. And although they did bring in other resources, I think that there was a lot that was not looked into right away, like checking the car to see if it was still warm, to see if maybe he had driven somewhere to dispose of the weapon, things like that. So that, yeah, I think that there's kind of a fine line between negligence and inexperience, and there should be some protocol, you would think.
I was just curious because in the one case where he said when he shot and then there was a blood trail that had their apartment, like why
That-
would they ask?
Yeah, that, in my opinion, was negligence. That was,
And that just doesn't line with the law enforcement, that's the prosecutor's office. Because if they're seeing that in the crime scene photo, okay, if the cops didn't interview anybody, well, then you better,
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
that's,
so I can understand
Yeah.
why the mom is so frustrated. And she hired this private investigator who found, and there are more details in the story too, but she hired a private investigator who found all these details. And the law enforcement said, local police department there in Salt Lake City said that they handed it off to a private investigative company and other law enforcement agencies to look into it. And they looked into it, and then they again called it suicide. But they don't address why no one questioned that person in the other apartment, who in fact is dead now. So there goes that. Plus, they gave the gun back to the original owner. Ida Mae says she doesn't even know who that is. They gave back all the evidence to her. The shoes that belonged to the roommate with blood droplets on the top. They said that the blood trail looked like it staggered, as if there were 3 people carrying this body. And the blood droplets are only on the left foot, on the left shoe of the roommate's shoes, not on the right. So it's almost like he was carried and placed there. And so now they've handed all of this evidence back to Ida Mae, and there is no case. There is no case anymore, because they've closed it. And all of this has been handed to Ida Mae, and now anything that they decide they want to investigate further, they can't use that evidence. It's lost its chain of custody. So it's out of police custody. So it's tainted evidence now. They can't use it. The only way that crime will ever be solved is if someone confesses. Yes.
The first story with Gene, they found his cell phone. Did they get anything off of that?
I don't think so. I don't think so. The friend, in this case, Dan, they had been drinking for a better part of the day, but they weren't drunk. They were hanging out at this bar. I don't know if they're playing cards or what they were doing, but everybody calls him Beaner, not Gene. So Beaner was at this, he had gotten up and cashed his check, $350. Then he went to the grocery store and bought $130 worth of groceries, took them home. And then he and Dan were going to go to this bar and hang out. So Dan came and picked him up, and Beaner wasn't even driving. And Dan, later on, it's probably 8 o'clock, 8:15, Beaner wanted to leave the bar, and Dan didn't. And Beaner said, well, I'm not hanging around here, so if you won't take me, then I'll go out and I'll find somebody else to give me a ride. So he went outside, and eventually Dan got up and said, fine, I'll give you a ride. So Beaner got in his vehicle, and then Dan said that he stopped at a friend of his farm, Sue Dice, and parked in the driveway, and he said that Beaner had passed out or fallen asleep in the front seat, but Dan went inside and talked for 20 minutes, and when he came out, Beaner was gone. Well, then he said he looked for him until like 11 o'clock, and he went and got his wife and looked for him, and they couldn't find him. And then they went to Pat's house, the mom, and said, we can't find Beaner. Did he show up here? Did he get a ride? You know, we can't find him. And Pat said, no, I haven't seen him, but go tell his brothers. And they were at the shop working with her boyfriend, Jeff. And so the brothers were like, oh, he'll show up. You know, they weren't too concerned. Then they couldn't find him the next day. And so then he never showed up. So they all went out looking for him. And eventually someone said that there were two boys who were out driving in the country that saw a man walking on this road not too far from this Sue Dice's house where Dan had parked. But that wasn't really like proof of anything. They just said they saw a guy walking, and that's all they found. And then they did find some footprints on that side of the road, but they kind of start and stop. So it could have been someone who just stopped, got out of his car, walked a little ways, maybe, you know, relieved himself or whatever, got back in. They found some footprints in that area, but they couldn't really tie it to Beaner. And so they're not really sure how he could have gotten in that slough. And I don't know if they ever really did track his phone for movement. So apparently there was really no evidence that could be found on his phone, which is sad. But you have to have just cause. I mean, Dan did allow police to come to his farm and search his farm, just a cursory search. They're not allowed to do anything invasive when it's given with permission. You can't move anything or touch anything or tear anything apart. And so they walked around, didn't find anything, but they didn't have just cause to get a warrant to do a more invasive search. So we don't know if Dan was involved or not. It's just there are a lot of unanswered questions surrounding his story and why Beaner would even get out and walk. You know, if he wanted to leave, he would have gone in the house and said, let's go. I want to go home. You know, or he would have called his mom because he had his phone on him. Because she said, oh, I've done that too. I've gone to pick him up. And I don't understand why you wouldn't call. And you can find his mom's Facebook page. She actually, there's one missing Beaner Prince or Eugene Prince on Facebook. And every single day she writes a note to him on Facebook. And she'll say today's 968 days of missing you, and she'll just fill him in on news or any new findings or her frustrations, or she talks about how much she loves him and misses him, and they're heartbreaking to read, but I'm sure that is her way of coping. So, any other questions? Yes.
With the 52 cases that you have in this book, I mean, is there anything more frustrating than having a case labeled as suicide when they were shot in the back of the head? I mean, there's at least two I know of where, I mean, sorry, we've all watched the movies, TV shows. That's not a way to commit suicide. I mean, is there anything else that jumps out as you just like, make you go, really?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, that case in particular is just bizarre. There was just a lot of frustrated people in that community. And people frustrated with the fact that the details don't seem to match up. And, you know, reports say there was blood trail and other reports saying there's not. And really, and this is another thing, there was no contact wound. And so if you were going to try and shoot yourself in the back of the head and get just the precise angle so that you wouldn't die immediately, you would almost certainly have to put the gun against your skin to steady it. Because I shake really bad after 2 cups of coffee, even without coffee. And I could, you know, I would be nervous. You know, any kind of gun to the head thing. How do you even reason that you could hold a gun steady without putting it against your skin and try and guarantee that you're going to survive this long enough to make it look like a murder? Or,
And what
you
would
know,
have been his motivation to make it look like a murder?
Right.
Like, was he trying to set somebody up?
right, his life insurance policy, from what I understand, didn't specify that it wouldn't pay out in the case of murder, it wouldn't pay out in the case of suicide. And actually, life insurance, Morgan's partner, James Buck, lived in California at the time, and Morgan had just started at the university, just a couple months before then. And so James was going to come later if Morgan really liked it. If Morgan didn't like it, why wouldn't he quit and just move home? You know, and James lives a very comfortable life. They have a beautiful home in California. Didn't need the money, but he did have life insurance. They had life insurance policies on each other. And when Morgan died, the life insurance said, we're not paying out. And James said, you can't prove one way or the other what happened. And eventually they did. They don't disclose it, but they did settle on a sum. It's just me. I just do that every time, just to stir things up.
just tested to make
Just
sure
to
gravity
make sure you're awake.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they did pay out, but it was an undisclosed amount. So apparently there was enough question involved in that case that made the insurance company say, well, okay, we got a point there. So, yeah, that is so fishy. And really, and they said it was suicide because there was a story found on his computer about a professor who commits suicide. And I'm like, this guy is incredibly intelligent. He's going to go to all this trouble of trying to guarantee that he can live long enough to make the sidewalk after throwing the gun in the dumpster. But he's not smart enough to take that story off his computer. How could somebody that intelligent be that sloppy? And I don't get why, if he was going to make it look like murder, why would he not have his coat on, his book bag, and his keys, make it look like he's just arriving for work and he got jumped? That would make more sense to me. And they said the reason they thought it was suicide is because there was blowback and gunpowder residue on his hands, but that could have been defensive too. So that's not proof of anything. Yes.
It might have been gunpowder on his hand, but was there gunpowder around the area where?
There was, well, they said there was no contact, no burn wound, so the gun was not touching his head.
That would be strange in itself.
Yeah. Oh, and I forgot to tell you that in Cody Rodriguez's case, the young Native American man was found dead inside the door of his apartment. There was no gunpowder residue or blowback found on his hands. So, and she got a written statement from the coroner saying that, but they still called it suicide. Yeah, and they said in Morgan's case that the gun was probably an inch or two away from the head. Yes, yes.
I was gonna say, unfortunately, politics can play into this if the DA is elected or appointed. And if it's election year, and if they're looking at a case that they don't think can be won, then they'll just shove a case to the side.
That could be, that could be. And I can't help but think that race plays into it too. Because there are a lot of cases. I spoke with family members, two specifically that stand out to me. One was a woman who was found dead in the river, and the FBI immediately said she drowned. That's case closed. But they found out she had been severely beaten and there was no water in her lungs. So they had to reopen it because it was proven that she was beaten to death and thrown in the river. And there's another case in this book about a woman. Well, no, it's not in this book. But I know of another case where the woman was found only half dressed. She had been beaten severely and looked like she'd been dragged through corn stubble. She was really scratched up and just in terrible shape. And they said, oh, she just died from exposure. So that's some of what you deal with in some of these cases is heartbreaking. Yes.
Do you want to explain how you came upon Tam's case?
Yes. When I first started researching this book, when I first started thinking about doing this book, I announced it at a book signing in Watertown, and then I started talking about it on Facebook. And I have a Facebook friend whom I've never met, Jane, and she said, oh, that's my cousin's daughter. Am I right? So Jane is your cousin? Yes. And she said, you need to get a hold of Nancy Haas. This is Tammy Haas, this is her daughter, and she was murdered. And so I said, oh, okay, well, send her a message or email or call her or whatever and tell her what I'm doing. Have her get in touch with me. And it wasn't too long after that another author friend of mine said, you know, I'm standing in line at a different author's book signing, and I met Nancy Haas, and she told me about her daughter Tammy, and I told her she should get in touch with you. And I said, yes, that would be great. I'm looking forward to getting in touch with her. So finally, I get a phone call from Nancy, and we're talking on the phone, and she said, you know, your name is really familiar. Did your daughter happen to go to Alpha Phi in Vermilion? And I said, yes. And she was in that sorority. She said, I was her sorority mom. I'm like, really? Well, okay, so yeah, okay, we might have met. And she goes, well, yeah, we have, because I was at her wedding and it was at your farm. So come to find out, we had met. She knows my daughter and she knows several people that I know and relatives of my husband, and so really small world. So because it was one of the first stories I investigated, I spent a lot of time with Nancy, and she and I have become very good friends. And I think having contact with her and getting to know her is what kind of changed the purpose and the trajectory of my book. Because at first, like I said, I thought it would be an interesting book. And then after a while, after getting to know the family members, like Nancy, and like Anna Mae Rodriguez, and Alice Millard's family, and AJ Lufkin's family, and Arnold and Ruby's family, I just felt like I owe it to them to put as many facts out there, unbiased facts as I can find in the newspaper reports, and then let them tell their story, let them contribute a picture and a tribute, because I want these people to feel real. I opted to publish this book with color photos, and that made it very expensive to produce. And I thought I could do it in black and white, but I wanted these people to feel real to the readers. When you watch shows like 2020 or Dateline, and they talk, they interview family members or friends and say, oh, she lit up a room when she walked in, or she was just the most generous person you ever met in your life. And they tell you stories about this loved one. And then they show you pictures and you think, wow, that person looks so real, and that it just feels like such an injustice, because you've become, they're real to you now. So now you care about the victim. And that's what I wanted. I wanted people to care about these victims, because then they're more inclined as readers to want to help. talk about it, to spread the word about these cases and maybe help bring some closure to the families. So, yes, thank you for that, Nancy. Any other questions? Yes.
This isn't a question, it's just what you're making me think right now. It's like, I grew up on a farm and everything was fine as a kid. But to think about the fact that there are people that you might meet on the street that have secretly, not been found out, murdered somebody, that's really creepy.
Right.
Because obviously they're good enough at it that they're able to go ahead with life and not be bothered by it and not have to tell somebody, I did this. Oh, wow.
There are statistics out there that talk about the odds of meeting a serial killer in your life are really very high. Not staying home. I'm not going anywhere.
Well, like BTK, he had a wife and kids.
Oh, yeah. He was an elder in the church.
Yeah,
He was involved with Sunday school.
imagine that shock.
Oh,
You're locking the doors and you're locking yourself in with it.
Right.
yes. And did you know, this one little statistic that should horrify you, the leading cause of death in pregnant women is murder.
Mhm.
Isn't that sad?
Yeah.
That's just appalling to me.
I've
Yes.
heard that the most dangerous, part for a woman is when they're pregnant. Yeah, like with their significant other or something.
Yep.
I don't know what it is.
Yep. That's just scary. Yes.
Yeah, this isn't South Dakota, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are about John Benet Ramsey.
Germany, oh my gosh. I'm kind of upset that the law enforcement won't send in the DNA results.
Well, they stepped all over that from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Really.
They have DNA that does not belong to a family member, from what I understand. And the family, the father is trying to compel the prosecutor's office to turn in that DNA evidence to try and send it to CODIS to get a hit. There's got to be somebody out there who knows. I mean, like, look at baby Andrew. They waited until DNA was more advanced. And then every year on baby Andrew's birthday, they sent it in to CODIS or to ancestry sites, where people want to find out their heritage, and that's where they found. There was a lateral relative, like a cousin, and so they figured out the approximate family that he was in, and then they narrowed it down to someone who would have been of childbearing age living in this particular region. They had a suspect. They went to her house. They went through discarded trash and got her DNA, and that's how they found her.
Mhm.
And she had gone on to marry the man who was the father of baby Andrew and had 2 more kids. She had a relationship with him when she put that baby in the ditch. I have a really hard time believing we didn't know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
What always makes me cringe or whatever is how in these small communities, how does a person not have a bias on a jury? Like, you hear about how this one jury member had a friend that was a friend of somebody and they refused, and it's like, the jury, how can they be
Right,
completely unbiased when you're in such a small community?
right. But on the other hand, when it affects that community, I mean, I kind of see why some cases are moved out of communities, but then there tends to be more of that family mindset of we're going to take care of our own, and a lot of the people in the community tend to be on the victim side. And they, I think they're probably more passionate about looking for the truth. And because of that, they can get more people who say, I know that family and they could never have done this kind of thing. Or I know the victim's family and we want to hear all the details. So I don't know if you'll ever find a case, especially one that's very highly publicized like John Benet Ramsey.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you'll ever find a case in which there aren't
Somebody that's
somebody that's biased.
right.
Yeah. Hopefully not compromised, but, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
On this past case, I was always wondering if her body was found in Yankton County.
No.
Instead of over Nebraska. If things might have not turned out different. They do have a person of interest. They think he did it. In fact, I thought they just brought him back to try him again or something, but they could, I don't know, I can't remember. But anyway, they do have a person definitely they're interested in and think he did it, but they can't prove it. But I just wonder if it was, my opinion, if it was dead, her body is found in Yankton, it might have been more, maybe better law enforcement or something, or, you know.
Maybe. One thing that I discovered about Tammy's case was that during deliberation, a question was sent to the judge from the jury saying, do we have to find him guilty of murder in this county? Does she have to have died in this county in order for us to find him guilty? And the judge said yes. And it makes me wonder if it weren't for that question, what would have happened? And I don't get why there are so many cases where they never have to prove where this person died in order to find the suspect guilty. So that part was really bizarre to me. I do have one little quick story before I sign copies. And this is about Jolene Haas. She is a young woman who was found murdered in her motel room in Rapid City. And I had found the story early in my investigation into this book. And there were very few articles about her, but the ones that I did find were not very nice. They talked about how she just led a fast life, and she was a waitress, and she ran with dangerous biker crowds, and she did drugs and drank a lot and was into prostitution, all kinds of awful things. And it said that she was supposed to be testifying in a trial in the upcoming week before she was murdered because she was an informant for law enforcement. And so I only found a few articles, and as I said, they didn't say anything really nice about her. And I thought, do I really want to share whatever salacious details they had about her? Do I want to share that in this book without really having any context or family members? You know, there wasn't hardly any outcry for her murder. That was the part I found the most disheartening, was that she was 22 and there was just no other articles about people demanding justice for this young woman's death. So I just kind of put it on the back burner. And right before I finished the book, I thought, I'm going to look into that one more time. Then I found a little bit in one of the articles that said that she was from the Fort Dodge, Iowa area. I thought, well, I'm going to look and see if I can find her family. And I found her mom's obituary. She didn't die too long ago. And I found that this Jolene had two sisters, Pam and Kathy. And I'm going to see if I can find Pam and Kathy. And I found Kathy in a neighboring town from Fort Dodge. And I even found the phone number, and I thought, there's no way this is going to work, but it worked. So I called her, and she immediately started crying and said, I can't believe somebody is actually looking into my sister's murder. I can't believe, and she was so moved. And she said, but I told her what I was doing, and she said, I just don't know if I really want it in the book, though, because, you know, there were just some really ugly things said about her, and I'm not sure if it's going to help. It was 1974, so it's unlikely that it's going to be solved. And second, I just don't know if I want to dredge all that ugliness up again for no reason. And I said, I completely understand, and I respect your decision. But we kept talking, and I really started getting to know Kathy, and she's telling me, well, yeah, I don't understand why she didn't use the gun that they gave her. And I said, because she's an informant. And I said, who gave her a gun? And she said, well, law enforcement did. And I said, they don't give guns to informants. No, you're on your own. You're an informant. It's usually to get a jail sentence or something, or you're trading, you're making a deal. but they don't give informants a gun. And she said, yeah, they gave her a gun, and in our town, she was hailed a hero because she put away an ex-boyfriend and that she was going to testify in a trial in the upcoming week. And I said, so that your papers called her a hero? And she said, yeah, my dad knew she was an informant and he wanted her to quit. And he'd known she'd been doing this for 3 years. I said, really? So I said, well, I'm not going to put it in the book if you don't want me to, but if you would, send me the articles from your hometown. So she sent me the articles, and our governor sent her a state flag with a letter of accommodation saying, thank you to the family for your daughter's service, for going above and beyond the call of duty. And I'm like, what? And then I saw that our then Attorney General, Marty Jackley, went to her funeral and gave the eulogy, and 6 detectives were her pallbearers. I said, they don't do that for informants. I mean, this is bizarre. And so I'm reading the articles, and she was actually an undercover narcotics agent. She was law enforcement. And I'm like, Kathy, she was law enforcement. And she goes, well, you know, that's why my folks weren't really, they didn't talk about it much. And they didn't talk about the articles in South Dakota, but she said, we just didn't want to bring up all that ugliness they said about her, that she did all these things, in her line of duty. And I said, I don't think she did. No, because if she's law enforcement, yeah, sometimes undercover people have to do some awful things, but I really don't think those things are true. So I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write the story as if I'm going to put it in the book. And if you like it, you send it to your sister. Pam was adamant. She did not want it in the book. And Kathy was kind of on the fence. So I said, I'm going to write this article, and then if you like it, I'll put it in there. If you don't, I respect your wishes. So I wrote the article. And in the midst of reading all of these Fort Dodge articles about her sister, the undercover narcotics agent, I found one line that explained it all. And it said, in early reports of her murder, it was not revealed that Jolene was an undercover narcotics agent, in the hopes that someone would confess to killing a snitch. So they put out all of these awful details about her, hoping that someone would brag about killing this narc, you know, because a narc is not necessarily undercover narcotics. A narc is someone who snitches. And they, you know, bad guys have very low regard for snitches. They brag about killing them all the time, but no one in the right mind would confess to killing law enforcement because they all know it's a capital offense.
And law
So-
enforcement usually pulls out everything goes on the table and they get
Right.
the killer of a law enforcement agent.
Right. So the sad thing is she was hailed as a hero in Fort Dodge. She was an undercover narcotics agent. She was part of law enforcement. But in South Dakota, she was labeled as trash. Unfortunately, that article that they circulated throughout South Dakota to try and get her killer to confess didn't work. They never did. And second, they never corrected it to say that she was an undercover narcotics agent, that she was actually law enforcement. And that, I think, is just a huge disservice to her and her family. And incidentally, she had been deposed for a preliminary hearing just a week before, and she gave all of the evidence to law enforcement then. So the person she was testifying against, they already had her testimony. So he killed her for nothing, and she was killed. So they had all the evidence against him. Incidentally, while he was out on bail, he was murdered. And his killer was later taken to jail. So the suspect, I should say, because they never really tried him for it. Anyway, any other questions? That I feel like was my feel good for the book.
So it did end up in there then, the story? The
Yes.
sisters agreed? Okay.
Yeah, yes, because after I rewrote the story, I forgot to include that part. I emailed Kathy and I said, Kathy, this explains everything. This is why we all thought it was, that's why we all believed all these awful things that all these papers said about her. It was all a ruse.
Mhm.
It was all meant to entrap this killer. It didn't work. But I said, all those things were a lie. So she was so glad to know that. And she said, you know, I never picked that out, that all of these early reports. And she said, we just knew some of the things that what the South Dakota papers said about her. But we didn't want to know more because we didn't want to believe that about our sister. So so I was so glad to have been able to do that for their family. And I feel like even if none of these cases ever get solved, I did bring that. I kind of brought some justice to her family and kind of, you know, helped her sisters kind of come to terms with their sister's death. And that she wasn't this awful person that the papers painted her as. So yes,
You said Marty Jacklin?
Marty Jackley.
Was that the funeral?
No, Janklow. Did I say Marty
Yes,
Jackley?
you did.
I'm sorry.
No, that is not.
I'm a little foggy. Yes,
You need more
was,
coffee.
yes, yeah, it was Attorney General Janklow at the time. Yes, he actually went and gave her eulogy. Yes, any other questions? Yes.
Is the case from over by Vermillion in there, the lady that was out
Alicia
fishing?
Homo. That's Tony's in here too. And I did, and being kind of on the receiving end of this book, sometimes I get emails, especially after I was interviewed by Angela Kennedy, people saying, oh, I know who killed Arden Anderson, or I know this about this person. And, you know, I did get some tips and some leads, and I'm like, go to the authorities. I want nothing with it to do. So I don't want to be in the middle. That's why I put law enforcement contact information after every single case, because I don't want to be in the middle of that. But I did find out some things about Alicia's case that I didn't tell you, so.
So are you going to do one of older cases you said something about?
I would,
Like,
I would probably put them in there more as a point of interest,
I mean,
but
I know
you know, like there are cases from the 1940s.
oh, yeah. This
You know.
one isn't, I was like 15 and my 15-year-old cousin was murdered in Sioux Falls. And I mean, they kind of thought they knew who did it, but she was going to testify. And
Who was that?
her name was Sherry Meter. Sherry Meter, M-E-E-T-E-R. Her parents are dead. Her brother is dead. She has a sister who's living. She was the youngest in that family. And I know, I mean, it's like the people who killed her had to be close to my age or maybe a year or two older, so they likely could be still walking the streets.
Right.
And they were drug people. But she's going to testify against them because she knew there were drugs and they.
I'm not familiar with that case.
She was drugged through, I mean, it's like when you were describing that body that had been drugged through the cornfield.
Yeah.
Because a relative was in the hospital and they said the guys who brought her in, they brought her in, the ones who probably did it, and said, oh, she wanted to get high, which she didn't, and she was shot full and then drugged. She looked like she had been drugged through.
Oh,
The
that's
streets.
heartbreaking.
And
I'm not familiar. When did that happen?
well, it must have been like about 1968. See, so it's before your timeline there. But I just thought, are you going to look into older ones? And
That would be interesting, yeah.
they're
Make sure you have the card, you can email me her information, because yes, I wouldn't be at all opposed to doing a second book. If I can get more information about those other 100 cases, or if I can find more cases that I'm not aware of, I will definitely do a second book. But I'm actually kind of looking forward to doing the third in the series. And I always tell them, you know, this was interesting, but I was not prepared for how emotionally and mentally grueling it would be. So I'm kind of looking forward to getting back to writing fiction so I can make stuff up. So,
yeah, you can make it turn out the way you want it to.
yes, and then I can have a happy ending, somewhat. Yes.
One last, so when that is available for audio, where would one find it?
Probably on Amazon.
Okay.
Mhm. Yes, they're all available on Amazon. This one is also available through Barnes and Noble and Target.
Who's your publisher?
Pardon me?
Who's your publisher?
I published them all myself. Yes, yes. This one initially was published by a publisher, but they went out of business. Unfortunately, I kept the rights to the book, so I ended up publishing that one myself again. And these are just published through Amazon. And this one I decided to go through Ingham Spark because Ingram is a warehouser for Barnes and Noble. So Barnes and Noble in Sioux Falls and Sioux City picked it up. Like right after it came out, there were a lot of people going in and asking for the book. And they tell me it continues to fly out the door. And I wish that meant more money, but actually, I will be honest with you and tell you that because this book costs so much to produce, I found out that I only make 60 cents a book of sales that are done through online or through bookstores. I only make 60 cents a copy. So I make my money selling these books myself. So, you know, I make a few bucks.
And I think your return is better on Amazon than Barnes and Noble.
And these are only published on Amazon, and yes, I do make more money. And this one is only published on Ingram, but I think I am going to publish this one on Amazon as well because I own the ISBN on it. So I'm going to see if maybe I can make a little bit more money on it through Amazon. And I just want to clarify, I did not do this for the money. We are quite comfortable, and these books are such a raging success. I do okay. So we're quite comfortable. I did not do any of this for the money. I just always wanted to be a writer. But my whole goal in publishing this book was to see one or more of them get solved.
A
So,
good karma,
pardon me?
then. A good karma.
I hope
Things
so.
come back to you in different ways.
I hope so. That's why I always write blessings on the inside of this book. I never say enjoy because nobody should enjoy reading that. So I'll be up here signing and selling copies if anybody has any questions, or if you want to come up and get one, you're free to do that.
If anybody wants an update,
What's this?
Don't.
Come on.
minute left, Dome 16, Mount Harding 26.
Yay!
And those of us that do write nonfiction for a living sometimes do fiction as well. This morning's
As you can see.
parade was actually done in honor of Christine.
Thank you.
Not really. Everybody else thinks it's for the homecoming for the college, but.
Do you want me to send it to you?